This is lecture 3 of our Introduction to Semantics, covering chapter 3 of the textbook. In our previous chapters, we were looking at propositions and terms that can operate over propositions, but we took for granted that those propositions had truth values, and we didn't ask how we figure out what those truth values are. But obviously, propositions can be complex things. Propositions are the interpretations of our sentences, and sentences have pieces that make them up. In this chapter, we're going to be looking at some of those pieces that form the core, the center part of interpretation of English sentences. They are going to be predicates and arguments. We have different kinds of expressions in English, and those different kinds of expressions, they can show their differences in how we think about them. So I will use what I call the picture to yourself test to illustrate. We have a sentence, John smiles. And I ask you to picture to yourself, John smiles. If you know who John is, you have no problem doing that. Even if you don't know who John is, you might still be able to do it. You kind of put a random individual and you assume that that person is John and you picture that person smiling. Okay. Same with John. If I tell you, picture John. Okay, if you know John, you picture him. And if you don't, you do something similar to what we just did for John smiles. You picture somebody, you assume that person is John, okay? But you can't do a trick like that to picture smiles. How do you picture smiles? It doesn't seem to be the kind of thing you can picture. Not someone smiles, not John smiles, just smiles by itself. It can't be done. The meaning of smiles is more like instructions on how to make a picture out of pieces. In particular, smiles takes one piece that you can picture, for example, John, and it gives back something else that you can picture, namely John smiles. And it tells you how to do that. Roughly, it says, slap a smile on the individual you get. Okay. So that it's kind of hard to do this in pictures, but you can think of it, you start off with John, that's what the word John gives you. And you have smiles, which is instructions to take that and replace the box to make a picture. You replace the box by putting the person there so that that little smile is on his face, and you get back the picture. Okay, so we have these three different expressions, John smiles and John smiles. We're going to say that they have different kinds of roles and interpretations and denotations. In syntax, smiles is acting as a syntactic predicate. We can also say it acts as a verb or a verb phrase. There are many ways of describing its syntax. It's going to have a logical translation as a semantic predicate. And that semantic predicate is going to have a denotation, and the denotation is going to be a set theory denotation. It's a set of individuals. The English expression John isn't acting as a syntactic predicate, it's acting as a name. You can also say it's acting as a noun phrase in syntax. It's translated into logic as a term, and it's a term whose denotation is an individual. So here we can see at the level of denotation, John is a different kind of thing from smiles. John denotes an individual, smiles denotes a set of individuals. For the sentence, John smiles, its syntactic role is exactly that, a sentence. Its logical translation is as a formula. And as we saw earlier, formulas denote truth values. So in predicate, what we're going to do is expand our logic from propositional logic to predicate logic by adding a way of dealing with predicates. Predicates that take terms as arguments. Our general form of a predicate argument structure in logic has a predicate which we will write in all capital letters, followed by some number of terms, term 1, term 2, term n, where n can be 1, can be 0, can be 2, can be 10, can be any number you want. We will write the terms with no capitals. So in the case of smile, our sentence John smiles will be translated into predicate logic as capital smile applied to non-capitalized John. Capitalized John will be the English expression. Non-capitalized John will be the term in predicate logic. Capital smile denotes a set of individuals. Small John denotes an individual. Capital smile of small John denotes a truth value. But this raises a question. How do we get a truth value from a set of individuals and an individual? Let me illustrate. Suppose there are 5 individuals in the world, A, B, C, D, and J. They're named Alice, Betty, Charles, David, and John. Okay? And suppose further that of these people, A and B smile, but C, D, and J do not. Then we have these English expressions, logical translations, and denotations. The English expression smiles has a logical translation smile with a denotation set AB. The English expression John has a logical translation small John, denotation J. And the sentence John smiles, smile of John, has smile of John as its logical translation and false as its denotation. But how do we get false from the set AB and the individual John? We can't just put the two together. We can't just put smiles denotation and John's denotation together. We get a list. It's a list that has set AB and J. That is not false, whatever it is. It's a list. So to get a false denotation for the sentence interpretation, we're going to add a formula denotation rule. It tells us how to get the denotation from a formula, in particular from a formula that's made up of a predicate and a single term. A formula of the form predicate of term denotes true if the denotation of the term is a member of the denotation of the predicate. It denotes false otherwise. So we can apply this rule to our formula, smile of John. The denotation of that formula is going to be true if J is a member of the set AB, and it's going to be false otherwise. In this case, since J is not a member of the set containing A and B, smile John is false. Now, English contains one-place predicates like laugh, fall, amazing, happy, nurse, dog, out. These are our various categories: verbs, adjectives, nouns, prepositions. It also has two-place predicates, like the verbs see, kiss, say, the preposition from, with, the noun brother, picture, the adjective proud. It has three-place predicates: give, tell, say, send, teach, introduce. And you'll notice that I have the word say in two different lists because we have some sentences that have two arguments to say. John said it's raining. And some that have three. John said to Mary that it's raining. Okay. We have a question. Which of these, how do we go ahead and represent these in logic? How do we translate sentences that have one, two, and three-place predicates into formulas of logic consisting of predicates and their arguments? And we can make a hypothesis that the translation is very straightforward, that a one-place predicate translates to, of English, translates to a one-place predicate of predicate logic. So, for example, John laughs would translate as laugh applied to John. Two-place predicates like see could translate to two-place predicates of predicate logic, capital C, taking two terms, term one and term two as their argument. Give, the three-place predicate of English, could translate as a three-place predicate of logic. Okay, that's maybe an obvious thing to say, but we're going to see soon that has certain challenges that have to be dealt with. Now, we've added to our inventory of expressions, to the expressions that we have to look at. We now have not just one-place predicates describing properties of individuals, but two-place predicates and three-place predicates. And these do not describe properties of individuals. They describe relations among individuals. If I tell you John sees Mary, sees is not telling you a property of John. It's telling you that John is related to Mary in a particular way. So our predicates are going to describe relations, not properties, when they have two or three places. And in order to do that formally, precisely, we are going to introduce into our set of denotations ordered pairs and ordered triples. An ordered pair, written angle bracket AB, is an ordering of two individuals, here A and B. It's also called a two-tuple. I won't use two-tuple for pairs, but the word tuple is useful when generalizing to any number of arguments, because we can put any number before the word tuple. An ordered triple, angle bracket ABC, is an ordering of three individuals, called a three-tuple also. So when we look at expressions, logical expressions will have denotations, and those denotations can be described now in multiple ways. For something like smile, a one-place predicate, its denotation is smile prime, also describable as the set of individuals who smile, and also describable as a set containing A, B, etc., where A, B, etc. are those individuals who smile. Tuples come in with two-place and three-place predicates. With the two-place predicate C, Its denotation, C prime, can be described as the set of ordered pairs of individuals xy such that x sees y, or we can put it as the set, and we go ahead and we put ordered pairs in there. The ordered pair AB, the ordered pair AC, the ordered pair BC, where all of those ordered pairs are pairs, the first of which sees the second. Now, a very important thing about ordered pairs is that the order matters. That should be obvious from calling them ordered pairs. So if A sees B, but B does not see A, then the ordered pair AB will be in the denotation of C, but the ordered pair BA will not. Okay, so we can connect our situations with sets of ordered pairs like this. Suppose that Alice sees Betty and Charles. Betty sees Charles and David, and no one else sees anyone else. Then the denotation of C is the following set. It's a set containing the pairs A, B, that's Alice and Betty, AC for Alice seeing Charles, BC for Betty seeing Charles, and BD for Betty seeing David. Now, our original formula denotation rule told us what to do when we had a predicate that had a single term as argument. We've added predicates with 2 arguments and predicates with 3 arguments. We will be adding predicates with more arguments later. We need a way to give an interpretation for formulas containing predicates with any number of terms. So we'll do it as follows. Consider a formula of the form predicate applied to term 1 through term n. Okay, each of those terms is part of our predicate logic. It's, if you will, a symbol, a word of our predicate logic. And each of them will have its own denotation. We'll take term 1 to have denotation T sub 1, term n to have denotation T sub n, and in general, for any term of the form term sub I, we'll take it to have a denotation T sub I. Okay? And with that assumption, we're going to give the following revised formulation denotation rule. A formula of the form predicate applied to terms 1 through term n is true if the n tuple made up of the denotations of all of those terms, that is, the n tuple T sub 1 through T sub n, is a member of the denotation of the predicate, and it's false otherwise. So this is essentially the same thing as our original rule, but instead of allowing only one term, we've expanded to allow tuples of terms as well. When we apply it to our example, we'll see that the formula C Betty Alice is true if the tuple, the ordered pair BA, is a member of the set of ordered pairs containing the ordered pairs AB, AC, BC, and BD, and it's false otherwise. Since the ordered pair BA is not a member of that set, C Betty Alice is false. This now gives us analysis of the sentence, Betty sees Alice, and we can now say why that sentence is false in the situation that we gave. Now, we've said something about English sentences being translated into formulas of predicate logic. They're translated into something of the form of a predicate followed by a certain number of arguments. And now I want to look a little bit more in detail about that connection between the English predicates and the predicates that translate them in the logic. First, I want to look at the ordering of terms. In our analysis of the sentence, Alice sees Betty, we just automatically assumed that it will be translated as see Alice Betty. But there's no reason why we had to do that. Our logic can be defined however we want to. We can define it so that Alice sees Betty is translated into logic as C, say C sub 1, applied to Alice and then Betty. And we can take the denotation of that formula of logic to be well, given by what we gave before, it'll be true if the set of pairs Alice Betty is in the denotation of C, and the denotation of C could then be the set of pairs XY such that X sees Y. And the important part here is that X is the one who is doing the seeing. X is the first member of the pairs. Y, the second member, is the one being seen. But we could just as easily have decided to switch the arguments around and say that the English sentence, Alice sees Betty, gets translated into logic, predicate logic, as this other predicate, C2, that takes the seen individual, Betty, first, and the one who does the seeing, Alice, second. In order to make use of that in our logic, we would need to say that the denotation of C2 is a set of ordered pairs, X, Y, such that Y, the second individual in the ordered pair, sees X, the first individual. That is, we have to, if we switch the arguments around in the predicate logic here, we also have to switch them around inside the denotation of our predicate C2. Now, we chose C1, and we didn't put the 1 on it, we just used C. And there's a reason for that, but we could have chosen C2. Some people actually do prefer the opposite order, but we're going to use C1 throughout. And we're going to use it for the same reason that people historically have chosen it. Historically, the people who created this and have used it the most were speakers of English and German. And the order of the arguments matches the order of the arguments in the formula of logic was chosen to reflect the order of arguments of the English. Here, Alice comes first, Betty comes second. In the predicate logic translation, Alice comes first, Betty comes second. And we do this as a general rule. We translate English sentences into logical formulas in which the order of terms matches what could be called the normal order of English arguments given below. The subject comes before the direct object. That would be John before Mary, and John sees Mary. The direct object comes before the indirect object. That would be chocolate before to Mary, and John gave chocolate to Mary. The indirect object comes before the complement, that would be like to Mary before that it's raining, and John said to Mary that it's raining. We use this as a way of choosing among the possible translations into predicate logic. Not because it's magic, not because it has to be done, just because this is the way it's been done. Another choice we have to make, it can be made a little bit more in principle. It's a choice about the number of arguments we give to our predicate logic predicates. So let's look at two English sentences. The English sentence, John eats, and the English sentence, John eats the cake. Can we translate both of these sentences as follows? Eat applied to John for John eats, and eat applied to John, comma, the cake for John eats the cake. The important thing about this translation is that it uses the exact same predicate eat in the predicate logic that's here. This predicate eat and this predicate eat are the same. We could do that, but we won't. And the reason we're not going to is because in order to do that, we essentially have to treat this predicate, the predicate of our predicate logic, as ambiguous, as having two different ways that it can work. It can take one argument here, or it can take two arguments here, and that would be a semantic ambiguity in the logic. One of our reasons for choosing to translate things into logic is so that we can get rid of the ambiguity, so that we can show ambiguities of English by showing that they translate into different things in predicate logic. And this would make it impossible for us to do that with sentences like these. So I'm going to assume that the logical predicates are unambiguous because that is more useful for us. We can still ask, is the English word eats ambiguous? And we can still give two answers, yes and no, and we can ask which one is the better answer. So we're going to spell that out by giving two different options. One, we take eats as ambiguous. And what we mean by that is that the English word eats sometimes gets translated into logic as eats of one, which takes only one term as argument. And sometimes the English word gets translated as eats of two, which takes two terms as arguments. Okay, that's option one. Option two takes eats to be unambiguous. Eats always, it doesn't matter whether it's in the sentence John eats or in the sentence John eats the cake, it always translates as eat. It always translates as eat, but eat always takes two terms as argument. To get that to work, we take the interpretation of John eats to be a little more complex than it looks. In the logic, we take it to mean for some x, eat John x. Can we choose between these? Which one is better? Both of them allow us to describe the two sentences, John eats and John eats the cake, in logic. But it turns out we can make a choice between them. In particular, we can choose option two as better than option one. We're going to choose by making an observation and asking which options predict that observation. The observation is this, that the sentence, John eats the cake, in English entails the sentence, John eats. If John eats the cake is true, it follows that John eats is true. It is impossible for John eats the cake to be true and John eats to be false. That's what entailment means. Now, can we explain that entailment using option 1? Well, the answer is no. Let me give you a kind of intuitive way of seeing that first, and then a formal way second. The intuitive way of seeing it is to say, eat 2 is a completely separate expression from eat 1. I know they both start out the same with E, A, and T, but they don't finish the same. One ends up with a 2 and one ends up with a 1. And that's enough to make them different predicates. They are as different as, say, the predicates see and smile. If somebody asked you, does see John the cake entail smile John? You'd say, no, those two predicates are unrelated. There's no connection there. Well, the same thing follows here. Eat 2 and eat 1 are unconnected. So to say eat 2 applies to John and the cake does not tell us anything about whether eat 1 applies to John. We can spell it out formally like this. Eat 2 applied to its 2 terms, John and the cake, is true if the ordered pair made up of the interpretation of John, that's J, and the interpretation of the cake, that's C, is a member of the denotation of this predicate, eat 2. Eat 1 of John is true if John, or maybe we could say the ordered 1 tuple, there's no real ordering involved, but it's a 1 tuple, John, is a member of the denotation of eat 1. But we ask, is it possible for this JC to be a member of eat 2 and this J not to be a member of eat 1? And the answer is yes, because eat 1 and eat 2 are unrelated. The truth of 1 is independent of the truth of 2. And so this option of treating eat, the English word eat, as ambiguous, as sometimes meaning eat 1 and sometimes meaning eat 2, does not predict our observed entailment. That makes option 1 not a very good option for us. Okay, same observation, and we asked, does option 2 explain the observation? That is, does the predicate logic interpretation that we've given in option 2 for John eats the cake entail the predicate logic interpretation that we gave for John eats? And there the answer is yes. And the reason is because this time we've used the same predicate twice. Informally first, eat John the cake will be true if John ate the cake. For some x, eat John x will be true if John ate something. Well, if John ate the cake, then John ate something, namely the cake. It's not possible for the first to be true without the second to be true. And this looks like it can explain that for us. It can tell us why we have that. Now, a little bit more formally. Eat John the cake here is true if, just as before, the ordered pair consisting of John and the cake, J and C, is a member of the denotation of eat. Okay, And we're going to use that same denotation of eat down here for determining when this is true. This is going to be true if, for some individual x, the ordered pair j comma x is a member of eat. This x and this x, this is a variable. A variable is like a placeholder. It says put something in that place. If you can put something in that place so that the result here is a member of eat, then this is true. Well, we just said up above the sentence John eats the cake is true if we put J and C in there. And that ordered pair is a member of eat. So suppose that John eats a cake is true. That means that the ordered pair JC is a member of eat. And that means that for some individual x, namely the individual C, the ordered pair JX is a member of eat. The denotation of eat. That is, if this is true, if John eat John the cake is true, then for some x, eat John X is true. Option 2 predicts the observed entailment. It predicts that John eats the cake should entail John eats. And that makes option 2 better than option 1. Now we still have the question of what to do about these two sentences. We notice that with the sentences involving eat, the object can be there, John ate the cake, or it can be missing or optional, we say. With eat, the object is optional. Other sentences, however, don't work the same way. Consider sentences using the word devour. Devour means to eat quickly. So alongside of John ate the cake, we have the sentence John devoured the cake. However, although John ate is a perfectly fine sentence, John devoured, for some reason, is not. We can describe that by saying that with devour, the object is obligatory. It needs something. With eat, the object is optional. Okay? That's a description. It's not yet an explanation. We want to know why that's the case. And we're not going to be able to give a complete answer to that why, but we are going to show where that answer has to be. One possibility would, of course, be to say that eat is ambiguous. There's an eat 1 that takes 1 argument and an eat 2 that takes 2 arguments. But devour is not. There's only devour 2 that takes 2 arguments. That would give us an explanation, but we already tried that explanation out before, and that explanation didn't give us what we wanted for explaining entailment. So if it didn't work for entailment, it's not a good idea to say, well, we're going to use it somewhere else anyway. We want a single explanation that explains everything. This might explain ambiguity, but if it doesn't explain entailment, then it's not the right option to choose. So we're left with option 2. In option 2, eat was unambiguous, and so devour is probably unambiguous too. But we have a distinction now that can be described as follows. Eat can take either 1 or 2 syntactic arguments. In the syntax, it can have 1 expression it combines with, as in John eats, or 2, as in John eats the cake. But semantically, it always takes 2 arguments. That is, the logical translation, capital EAT, is always the same, always takes two terms as arguments. Okay, then what do we say about devour? We say devour takes two syntactic arguments, always, and two semantic arguments. So the difference is going to have to be a syntactic difference, a difference in the structural requirements of the terms, of the words eat and devour. And since this is not a syntax class, it's a semantics class, we're not going to try to give you the explanation of what that syntactic difference is. Okay, so we've just allowed our syntax and our semantics to kind of come apart. We've allowed syntax to have one argument where semantics has two. That means we can't trust the syntax to tell us how many arguments we have in semantics. So if the number of syntactic arguments of a predicate can be different from the number of its semantic arguments, how do we know how many semantic arguments a predicate has? Well, we can go back to our picture to yourself test. I'll put it this way. We can look at what is conceptually necessary in order to have a proposition, something picturable. What do you need to have in order for something to be picturable to yourself? Can you conceptually picture smiling without also picturing something or someone who smiles? If the answer is yes, then smile doesn't need a semantic argument. If the answer is no, then smile does need a semantic argument. And we saw above, before when we tried this out, you cannot picture smiling without picturing somebody doing the smiling. And so that someone is a necessary semantic argument to smile. Okay? We're going to look at what's needed in order to form a complete picture that you can picture to yourself. Now, let's go ahead and make that proposal a little bit more concrete. The proposal is the following. The semantic arguments of a predicate are those arguments that are required in order to make a proposition that can be conceptualized or pictured to yourself or imagined. And from what we just said, according to this proposal, John, the term, is a semantic argument of the predicate logic predicate smile. If you took John away from smile of John, you get something we can no longer picture to ourselves. This proposal has an interesting consequence. We end up actually with more semantic arguments than we have seen so far. Because, for example, we cannot imagine John smiling without him smiling at some time and in some location. According to the proposal then, smile has to have at least 3 arguments, not just somebody who smiles, but also a time at which they smile and a location where they smile. Okay, so what do we do with the sentence John smiles? That didn't say anything about location. It might have said something about time in our tense. We haven't looked at tense yet, and we won't for a long time. But what we're going to do is we're going to treat those arguments, those semantic arguments that don't show up in the syntax, the same way that we treated the optional object argument of eat. There we said we could just put a variable in the place of the object and say something, say for some X. Okay, we'll do the same thing here. We're going to say that John Smiles has the following as its official complete translation. For some time t and for some location L, smile John T. L. So our predicate logic symbol smile, all caps, is a three-place predicate. It takes three arguments, three terms. In this case, one of them is the name John. One of them is a variable t, which is a variable that gives us a time. And the other is a variable L that gives us a place. The sentence, John smiles, doesn't tell us anything about the specific time or a specific place. It just says that there is a time and a place at which John smiles. Now, if we have that time and a place, it stands to reason we should be able to say more about them with our English sentences. And yes, we can. We can refer to these times and places. We can refer, for example, to the place as in the park. We can refer to the time as yesterday in the sentence, John smiled in the park yesterday. Here we have a sentence that's true if John smiled at a time that is yesterday, that is a place that is in the park. The question now arises, how should we represent yesterday and in the park? Should we treat them as terms the same way we treat John? That gives us capital smile applied to three terms, John, yesterday, and in the park, as our translation of the English sentence, John smiled in the park yesterday, into predicate logic. Now, if we do that for the short sentence we just gave, we have a question of how we translate the longer sentence below into predicate logic. Here, it's John smiled yesterday in the park in the afternoon near the fountain. That has five things that look like they should be acting as arguments if yesterday and in the park count as arguments. But if that's the case, we need a five-place predicate, smile sub 5, to combine with those five arguments. That would be smile sub 5, taking applied to John, yesterday, in the park, in the afternoon, and near the fountain. Now we can do that, but we have a problem. And the problem is this. John smiled yesterday in the park in the afternoon near the fountain entails John smiled in the park yesterday. But if we use different predicates for the two sentences, smile 5 for the longer sentence and just smile for the shorter sentence, then we don't predict the entailment because the predicate logic formulas using those two different predicates don't entail each other. Smile sub 5 with 5 arguments, in fact, does not entail smile with 3 arguments, no matter what those arguments are. So we're going to give a different analysis, a better analysis that's going to save the analysis that we gave for John smiled as a part. And it's going to use yesterday and in the park to add more information about our variables t and p. So John smiled in the park yesterday is going to say, for some time t and for some place p, smile John t p. And yesterday t, that is t is a time sometime in yesterday. And in p the park, that is p is a place located in the park. If we do that, then we can give an analysis of the longer sentence that entails the shorter one. The longer sentence, John smiled yesterday in the park in the afternoon near the fountain, has this as a piece for John smiled. It has this as a piece, which is exactly what we gave earlier for John smiled in the park yesterday. And all it does beyond that is add these two bits. More information about our time. It says our time t is in the afternoon. More information about our place. Our place P is near the fountain. And the longer sentence entails the shorter sentence for a very simple reason. In logic, anytime you have a formula of the form P and Q, if that is true, then the formula P, this P, is also true. So we explain why the longer sentence entails the shorter sentence by giving this somewhat more complicated way of analyzing the sentences. We keep this for some time in some place part, and we keep these variables here as variables, even when we're saying more about them. The more about them is simply conjoined. It's put together with and to say other things about the time, other things about the place. Okay, now I want to look a little bit more in detail at prepositions. Prepositions can do at least three different things, the first of which we've just seen. Prepositions can describe a location. And we can have many different prepositions going together to describe a location. So John stood on the chair near the door behind Mary. We have three preposition phrases: on the chair, near the door, and behind Mary. And all three of them tell us something about John's location. Now, before I said for some place P, and here I'm saying for some location L, and that was because I just forgot to change my place P into location L before making these slides. Okay, they're saying the same thing. So this sentence tells us that for some location L, stand John at that location L. And that location is on the chair, and that location is near the door, and that location is behind Mary. This is just what we saw before. Change now to use L for location instead of P. And this is why I used L for location instead of P. It's because the second thing that a preposition can do is describe a path, and path I wanted to use P for. Okay, so consider the following sentence. John sent Mary down the hill through the tunnel to the store. We have three preposition phrases describing Mary's path. Each describes part of the path, not the whole path. Down the hill, that means part of that path went down the hill. Through the tunnel, part of the path went through the tunnel. To the store, part of the path went to the store. Okay, so we're going to analyze that in a very similar way to location. The only difference is that we put path here instead of location. For some path P, send John, Mary, P, and down P the hill. P is a path that goes down the hill. Through P the tunnel. P is a path through the tunnel. To P the store. P is a path to the store. Okay, the third use of prepositions is one that causes English foreign learners of English a lot of problems. There are expressions like go over. The expression go over can be understood literally as moving over something. But it's more commonly understood as a phrasal verb with a meaning like review. So you and I have made some plans and we finished them, but before we decide to actually act on them, we want to review them first. John goes over the plans. He reviews the plans. Now, perhaps the expression go over has a meaning that relates somehow to the meaning of go and somehow to the meaning of over. But if so, that relation is a very complicated one. It's not just the one that you would get by putting the normal go together with over. We can do that. We can say John goes over the plans, meaning literally John travels in or moves in a path that goes over the top of those plans. Perhaps somebody put the plans on the floor and John walked from one side of those plans to the other. Then John goes over the plans. But the much more common translation doesn't involve going over in that way. And so we're going to just go ahead and give the phrasal verb translation in this way, with go hyphenated, go over hyphenated. It's got go, a hyphen, a dash, over, and we treat that as a single predicate. For the literal goes over the plans where John walks over them, we'll use something just like what we did for the path interpretation of send Mary. For some path P, go John P. This is John goes along that path, or goes that path, if you will. And that path is over the plans. So we can tease apart two different meanings for these expressions that are that contain a verb and a preposition, at least for some of them. Preposition phrases, names, those aren't the only things that can be arguments. We can also have sentences as arguments. English has complex sentences that contain, or as we say, embed other sentences. To translate these into logic, we allow formulas, that is the translation of English sentences into predicate logic, to be terms as well. And here I'll just show you what that looks like without telling you how to interpret our predicate logic. The interpretation of these things is a little more complicated and will be put off until chapter 8. But we can see what the translations into logic should look like. The sentence, John believes that Tokyo is south of Hong Kong, has a sentence here. Tokyo is south of Hong Kong. That's included, embedded in the entire sentence. And we want the logical translation to show that. Well, so what we do is we take that sentence and we translate it as a logical formula. Here it's going to be the formula south applied to Tokyo and Hong Kong as arguments. We ignore the word is. Then we can give an interpretation, a translation of the whole sentence into logic by translating the English word believes as predicate logic believe, the English word John as predicate logic John. We ignore the that, and we end up with this as a predicate logic translation of the English sentence. It has a predicate believe that takes an individual John and a proposition south applied to Tokyo and Hong Kong as its two term arguments. We can also have sentences in subject position. That John answers the question shows that John is smart. This one has sentences both as subject and object. And we put predicate logic translation of the first sentence as the first argument of show in the logic. And we give the translation of the second sentence as the second argument of our translation of show in the logic again.